Sorry, Mike, I had to switch it over to me being the host.
Oh, instead of me, Austin Gastrell being the host?
Yes, there's two of us here.
I'm gonna have to fix that. I didn't even think about it until the meeting was just getting ready to start.
All right, we got the presentation up, but we'll probably give it another minute or two for people to get logged on.
All right, Mike, you want to get started?
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Breakfast with Parking Reimagined. My name's Michael Davis, even though it says Austin Gastrell on the screen, and I'm the project manager for this parking effort. My agency, Land Development Services, is teaming with the Department of Planning and Development on this project. Austin Gastrell, the other Austin Gastrell from Planning and Development, will be co-presenting with me this morning. We'll have Q&A after this presentation. If you have a question, you can electronically raise your hand to be called upon. Parking has a profound influence in Fairfax County. With some exceptions, all land uses are required to provide parking. Driving remains a common activity, and developers and property users feel obligated to provide it, even in places where it's not required. However, we must weigh the value of parking against other desirable community elements, such as affordability, equity, the environment, site design, and economic viability. The need to provide more parking than necessary and meet confusing and restrictive regulations hinders the accomplishment of these goals. The current regulations encourage placing a higher importance on driving and parking than the possibility of using excess parking to increase housing options, as one example. Regulations create challenges for startup businesses looking for affordable space when needing to meet paper parking requirements. The lack of flexibility creates lost opportunities to adjust development to preserve or enhance community space. Our presentation this morning creates an outline for an enhanced approach to parking regulation in the county, one that looks at the context of development, as well as acknowledging that flexibility and predictability are important considerations for continuing our efforts for better, more compact land design, affordability, and economic growth. Primary goal of this project is right-sizing parking requirements. This concept involves sizing parking to the average demand for it. This approach applies to all areas of the county, from rural, suburban to high-intensity urban development. Because of these differences in character, different minimum parking requirements should apply. In lower density areas, we propose conventional approaches to parking, but want to avoid burdensome requirements. In medium density areas, we're accommodating innovation, but allowing conventional approaches. In higher density areas, we're pushing for innovation and discouraging conventional approaches. Overall, the next wave of development investment should involve less parking. If we meet the goal of right-sizing parking requirements, then other important goals can be realized. Opportunities for better land stewardship occur, such as designing sites to exchange parking for community and green spaces. Less parking with better land design, access to multiple transportation modes, and a mix of uses dampens the need and desire for personal vehicle travel. From an administrative point of view, simplification and flexibility in our parking requirements is expected to create opportunities beneficial to the community. While we strive to right-size parking and requirements, we also know there are places and uses that present parking challenges. This project continues to evaluate options to address those issues. The Parking Reimagined project is intended to examine and adjust parking requirements and processes to provide community benefits. In our effort to create places where people want to be, autos and parking must have less influence in design. The Cap One site in Tysons, the Mosaic District in Merrifield, and Reston Town Center are great examples where a walkable, compact, mixed-use urban design has taken precedence over street-oriented surface parking lots that create a vehicle gulf between the roadway and the place you want to be. These Main Street and urban rail and transit accessible places are as much a part of the county's fabric as low-density tree-covered residential suburban development. Both places and the arc of development in between offer desirable characteristics for living, work, and entertainment. The county needs a balance to thrive, and this includes something as mundane as parking requirements. Our population is diverse. Some want to live in areas where personal travel in cars is unimportant relative to being surrounded by urbanity. Others want to live in a community where green spaciousness is worth a trade-off of driving to access even basic goods and services. This approach to parking seeks to acknowledge and respect these diverse perspectives. Further, we want to diminish obstacles to business opportunities. Meeting arcane parking requirements and rates designed for more car-centric activities of 30 to 40 years ago constrains new business ventures, reinforces poor land and environmental management activities, and creates opportunity costs for uses that will provide community benefit, such as more affordable housing. All of this helps the county succeed. With continued evaluation of a parking framework with our consultant, Nelson Nygaard, staff has created a proposed approach, which is depicted here. With the intent of right-sizing parking, this is particularly important where the densities and intensities of development allow for greater innovation and approaches. Thus, this map shows a concentration of areas subject to lower parking requirements. At least 90% of the county's land area will remain subject to baseline requirements with some proposed modifications. Lower minimum parking requirements are focused on areas defined in the comprehensive plan as growth areas. In this framework, the following tiers are proposed. In suburban centers, we want to recognize that while development in these areas is of relatively lower density, the concentration of development within these areas provides opportunities for modest connectivity and shared activities that reduce parking demand. A 10% baseline reduction is proposed. Revitalization areas such as community business centers, commercial revitalization areas, and commercial revitalization districts are proposed for a baseline 20% reduction, which is consistent with today's standards. Transit station areas and the Tysons Urban Center are areas adjacent to transit-oriented development districts and are proposed to have a 30% baseline reduction. These areas are generally planned for higher density mixed-use development with good access to Metro Rail, as well as higher quality transit availability and a more walkable environment. Transit-oriented development areas are proposed to have a baseline 40% reduction in minimum parking requirements. These are areas within 1/2 mile of a metro station. Since many of these areas are planned for development that complements Metro Rail with higher density and intensity and compact urban designs, parking should be minimized to support the rail and transit investments and create a pedestrian scaled community. For transit-oriented development, we are also proposing that property owners could adopt planned Tysons Corner low, no minimum requirements and parking maximums through the rezoning entitlement process or a staff administered process. Planned Transit Tysons, also referred to or also referenced as PTC zoning, are sites within the Tysons Urban Center that have been rezoned to the PTC district or have opted into the PTC through a staff administered process. The Tysons Urban Center is the county's downtown with the highest allowable densities. With acceptance of the PTC designation, property owners have low or no minimum parking requirements and maximum parking requirements. The project proposes to retain these criteria for the Tyson's Urban Center. The parking rates and area reductions under consideration with this project generally affect minimum requirements. Caps on parking, known as maximums, are only proposed with development that chooses to opt in to no minimum requirement. This option would only be available in the Tyson's PTC and in transit-oriented development districts. I note also that we have been looking at the relationship of accessible parking to parking reduction efforts. Our intent is to base this on the baseline minimums, even in areas and circumstances where parking reductions can occur. Now I'll turn this presentation over to Austin.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning. The next few slides show examples of base or minimum parking rates being examined by this project. The existing single-family attached dwelling or townhouse rate is 2.7 spaces per unit, with one space having convenient access to the street. In response to concerns regarding lack of available visitor or shared parking in townhouse communities, we are proposing to alter or redistribute the existing single-family attached rate by requiring that 0.7 spaces of the total 2.7 spaces required per unit are provided for visitor or shared parking uses. Reductions of the single-family dwelling rate, base rate, are currently only proposed in the transit station areas, transit-oriented developments, and PTC districts, so areas that are in close proximity to Metro Transit. The proposed multifamily dwelling rate under consideration is 1.3 to 1.6 spaces per dwelling unit. This is an example of parking rate right sizing. The Institution of Transportation Engineers maintains national parking demand data through their document, Parking Generation. ITE's data shows that national average parking demand for suburban non-transit served multifamily dwellings is 1.3 spaces per unit. Staff is also considering the possibility of a proposed multifamily dwelling rate based on bedroom number and where applicable multifamily dwelling reduction to the multifamily dwelling base rate may be applicable. So what tiers it could be applicable in, and just looking overall at how we create a rate for multifamily, let it be a per bedroom or let it be as is proposed currently per unit. The proposed restaurant rate under consideration is between 8 and 10 spaces per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area and between 8 and 10 spaces per 1,000 square feet of outdoor seating area in excess of 1,000 square feet. This is an example of rate right sizing and simplification. The size of a building or tenant space is a known factor throughout all phases of a project's lifespan. By transitioning to a single rate solely based on square footage, we can provide greater predictability for property owners and tenants. The proposed retail sales rate under consideration is between 3 and 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area. This is also an example of parking rate right sizing. Our current retail sales rate has not been revised since 1978. Since then, significant changes in shopping behavior have occurred, such as online sales, which have lowered parking demand. Local and national data shows that average non-December parking demand for all retail uses is below the current county requirement. Please note that this retail sales rate applies to a single standalone building or use. A building that has 2 or more retail uses is considered a shopping center and is then parked under the shopping center requirements. So this would be a single standalone retail use. The example on this slide shows how the proposed retail sales rate would transition or decrease throughout the proposed tiered framework. The minimum parking requirement or base rate would decline by 10% in the suburban centers, 20% in the 20% in the revitalization districts, 30% in the TSAs, 40% in the TODs or transit-oriented developments, and going up to the PTC district. Please note this project does not seek to change the maximum parking requirements which currently exist within the PTC district or zoning area. The existing office parking rate was last updated in 1988 when the 3 current rates were adopted. We are proposing to simplify this into two rates based on building size. The proposed office rate range under consideration for an office under 50,000 square feet is between 3 and 3.6 spaces per 1,000 square feet, and the range under consideration for an office over 50,000 square feet is 2 to 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet. Similar to retail uses, office parking demand has changed drastically in the last 35 years. Remote working and flexible in-office schedules were becoming more commonplace before the pandemic, lowering average parking needs for offices. Further within the county, rail and bus transit services have expanded, providing travel alternatives for employees. National survey data demonstrates that average parking demand for all office types is less than the current county requirement. This example shows how the parking requirement for an office over 50,000 square feet, in this case, a 125,000 square foot office, would translate through the tiered framework. The minimum parking requirement would decline again by 10% in the suburban centers, 20% in the revitalization areas, 30% in the transit station areas, and 40% in the transit-oriented development areas. This is also an example of parking rate right-sizing. The proposed warehouse rate shown is an example of rate simplification. Many industrial rates or uses have a parking rate based on number of employees and company vehicles, but a total minimum of 1 space per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area. We are proposing to simplify this rate by basing it on the square footage of the building or number of employees, whichever is less. The size of a building can be determined at all phases of a project's lifespan, and parking supply can be sized accordingly. Number of company vehicles is not constant, which can require excess parking to be provided. A requirement to provide additional parking can create hardships and prevent the establishment of new businesses. Basing of the proposed rate on square footage or number of employees, whichever is less, also allows for flexibility to address specific needs of a business, while also reducing conflicts which can arise when new tenants propose to take over existing tenant spaces. It is our intent to release draft parking rates organized by use categories incrementally throughout the summer and early fall. These releases will align with any future scheduled parking Reimagine open houses, and drafts are currently available on our webpage under the Documents tab. We currently have, I believe, almost all of our rates, if not all of our rates, out on our webpage currently, and we'll be also releasing later in the fall, we'll be releasing text of our administrative sections, reduction sections, and other sections of Article 6 being examined by this project. Clean and strike-through versions with footnotes explaining proposed changes are available on the webpage, again, for majority of the uses, if not all of the uses we have. Since the kickoff of this project in October of 2023, we've conducted nearly 60 project meetings, which include supervisor-sponsored town halls, individual project meetings with all board members, as well as meetings with board advisory committees, community service groups, community associations, industry groups, and internal county agencies to discuss and seek feedback on this project. Since January, we've met monthly with our community project work group to discuss elements of our proposal and gain their perspectives. These discussions have been important in modifying our proposal and framing our public discussions of it. Our initial public outreach efforts focused on values and rationales associated with the project. Our current phase of engagement is intended to give the community the ability to react and comment on tangible proposals. The updated project timeline before you shows our goal of bringing a completed proposal back to the Planning Commission and Board early in 2023. Lastly, as stated, we have a project webpage that is regularly updated with information and opportunities for the public to participate in the Parking Reimagine project. Thank you for your time this Saturday morning, and we are happy to answer any questions you may have. And I will say, if you don't feel comfortable coming on camera and asking your question, you can drop your question in the chat box, and we'll be able to read those questions out and answer them.
Kevin, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you for the presentation on a Saturday. I was looking at the commercial rates, and I didn't see anything yet about shopping center rates. I see the retail establishment. Is that going to just kind of have its own section to it, similar to the current zoning ordinance?
It will be integrated. We're still working on the shopping center rate, so we didn't include it with the full commercial rates that we posted to the website. But I think the shopping center rates will be out probably within the next week or so to add to the commercial rates that we released this week.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Fran, you have your hand up.
Good morning. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about parking at schools. Are you making any changes in that arena?
I'll let Mike address that question.
Thank you.
Sure. We are looking at school parking. There have been situations, particularly with high schools, where the parking that we currently require in the ordinance, which is 0.3 spaces per student, creates the need for a great deal of parking. And particularly for our older high schools, that has created some issues in meeting the parking requirement and having discussions about how they could meet or come close to the parking requirement. So we're working with school board on a different approach to looking at school parking from the standpoint of looking at providing a minimum amount of parking for employees and visitors, and not basing it so much on the school population. There is still in our proposed rates a measure based on the number of students, but it's a much higher ratio, so it's less parking required. The school board, particularly for high schools, they manage parking on the school sites. They assign parking to employees. They create an amount of parking for employees, and then whatever parking is left over is then students are allowed to park there by permit. So between the school's efforts to manage parking at high school sites and the changes that we're proposing, I think it's a more realistic parking requirement for high schools. We're also trying to use that same approach for elementary schools, which actually may require more parking for elementary schools. But that's still, all of this is still pending further discussions with school board and a final recommendation.
Well, will all of that be part of this package, or is that coming out later? When are we going to see that defined in a way that we could evaluate it?
The public, we released the public element of the parking rates just this week. So if you go back to the website, you should be able to find it's under private schools currently, but it applies to public high schools or in public elementary schools. But it's in the public rates on our website. And again, that was just added this week. So you can take a look at it there.
Okay, so it will be part of this package.
There will be a rate recommendation as part of the final package that goes to the Planning Commission and the board. Yes.
Okay. Right now, we have elementary schools that can't handle the parking. So I'm a little concerned about reducing the parking requirement when we can't handle what is currently out there.
Well, and Mike had just mentioned that we actually are possibly looking at raising the elementary school requirement to require more parking on elementary schools. But again, it's something we're looking at and maybe having further discussions with the school board. I would also add that all of our rates that are on the webpage, the public use category, commercial uses, industrial uses, residential uses, and agricultural uses, on the documents that are on there, there's a link to an email address, which is a shared email address for this project. If you have any comments, concerns, questions, recommendations for the project, please send them to that email address, which is on those documents, and we'll review your question or comments or concerns.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to add one thing with regard to elementary schools is there are two factors that go on with elementary schools. One is parking demand for special events and things like that, as well as the whole kiss and ride component that goes into elementary schools. So we know that there are these periods of the day when the kiss and ride often spills over into the streets, parents queuing up in their vehicles for that purpose. There are special events that occur at schools that have a higher parking demand than the average parking demand at an elementary school. So those are the things that we also have to weigh out as we consider what the appropriate parking rate for all schools are, whatever that recommendation ends up being.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is if a school has multiple programs, then the kiss and ride issue becomes greater. So if it's just a general education school, that's one thing. But if it's a general education school that also has hearing impaired, gifted programs and other programs in that elementary school, then the kiss and ride gets totally out of control.
Yeah, and part of that is an on-street circumstance. It's not, I don't know that some of the schools that some of the elementary schools, when they've done remodeling, the elementary school in my neighborhood is one of the schools that you described that has special programs that broaden the student population. When the schools do improvements, they try to design the interior lot for kiss and ride to try to accommodate more of that traffic. But there's still the queues. The demand for kiss and ride seems to be growing, particularly since COVID and all of that. So it's an off-site circumstance as well as an on-site circumstance. And I don't know that we want to build all this additional asphalt to address that time of day demand situation.
I'm not
So
suggesting
again,
that.
it's something that we're working with schools on to figure out the right approach. So,
Well, the last time I did a count, which was before COVID, we had 153 cars in kiss and ride in the afternoon.
all right.
All right, Najla, you have your hand up, and after Najla, we're going to go to the comment section where Sonia, I believe, has a question regarding bike parking. Go ahead, Najla. You're on mute.
Thank you. I have several questions. One, these are mainly minimum requirements for new development, right? And
Correct.
minimum requirements in terms of minimum available free parking, or is it parking in general?
Is the minimum requirement for parking on a site, which is inclusive of handicap parking, accessible parking, EV parking, or if there's a paid parking element, it would be inclusive of that too.
Okay, so basically we're gonna have much less space for parking cars, which I agree with because I would like to encourage people to take public transportation. But this only makes sense if you guys are working hand in hand with the public transportation folks. So what are the plans for increasing public transportation?
Mike?
Well, that is, again, we're working with our County Department of Transportation on this project. They're in an advisory role because of the relationship between on-site and off-site activities and related to parking. So from that point of view, it's not really our purview, I guess, in association with this project to be able to say, oh, we're going to increase these multimodal transportation opportunities as part of this ordinance effort. But we do understand that relationship, and that's part of what our approach really focuses on, is being more innovative in areas where we have more transit opportunities, more concentrations of transit, metro rail, bus, express bus service, that sort of thing. And also in areas where we have more walkability, more bikeability, more compact design, and that sort of thing, to kind of marry the concept of less parking with more options for getting around, and being able to anticipate that as well in some of these areas, particularly like the suburban centers, where we know we have transit with the Silver Line extension to Dulles Airport. FCDOT has made changes to their transit service operations, the bus operations in particular, to help serve those Silver Line stations in the western part of the county, which means adding more frequent service, adding more routes. I think they've added at least 2 additional routes in the western part of the county to help link people to the Silver Line stations that are going to be coming online in the next couple of years at least. So,
So that's all good. Yeah, I mean, you're from the county yourself, Mike, or you're from the contractor side?
I'm a county employee.
Okay.
I work for Land Development Services.
I'm glad to hear that. Then from the, because this is really going to benefit the developers a lot, because they're going to have much more space to build stuff and therefore make more money. And last time I attended, I said, well, can we then have the contract, the builders pay more into public parking to offset the gains that they are going to make by getting fewer requirements for parking. So
Cool.
for them to get more parking, less parking requirements and making more money in return, they participate with bigger shares into the public transportation. Does that make sense?
It does. Again, it's not something, I don't know that the ordinance is a very prescriptive kind of document. And from the point of view of saying, okay, well, this is how we're going to, these are the requirements that we're going to have for parking, and that sort of thing. There are sort of these subjective elements of, okay, what are the trade-offs that we're trying to enhance? And there are different processes in the county that developers go through to get entitlements for developing at a higher zoning level, for example. And those are areas where county staff can have a little bit more flexibility to negotiate these types of trade-offs that you're speaking of. In other circumstances, there's less ability to make those trade-offs happen. But I think part of what we're doing here is creating this sort of iterative approach of, okay, we're going to adjust these parking requirements and perhaps have lower parking requirements, particularly in these higher density development areas, which is where most of the entitlements happen. So it gives us more of an opportunity to have those types of conversations with developers about, okay, well, you can build less parking. What are you going to give us as part of that conversation? So there's that element, but there's also an ability to look at situations where, okay, we're changing the ordinance for parking. What other ordinance changes can we make that will enhance that ability? For example, we're looking at our parking lot landscaping requirements. And given the circumstance where we might, change this bubble over here with parking, it gives us an opportunity to change this bubble over here with landscaping requirements to say, okay, let's tailor this to what we're doing with parking. So it's kind of this building block approach that this is part of. It's constantly happening, but I'll say the big thing started with ZMod and the changes that came out of ZMod. And so this just is these are just more building blocks to get to a place where we want to be.
And really quick, I just wanted to address something. You had mentioned that, reducing of parking areas and what we're proposing, the base rates and the minimum requirements, which are going to impact 85 to 90% of the county. What we are doing there is we're simplifying and right sizing. And so some of these rates are one space per 200 square feet. Well, that didn't really make a whole lot of sense when we have other rates that are one space per 1,000 square feet. So some of the rates we're just simplifying to kind of all be in line. And other rates we are looking at lowering based on demand. So looking at what are national trends, what are local trends, looking at jurisdictional peers and just our own anecdotal research per county employees of, what is the appropriate rate for this use? This use, let's say retail. The current retail use was originally put in place in 1978. We can all agree that retail has changed a lot since then. So what we're doing is looking at that rate and then pretty much putting it into current terms. What is the appropriate rate now? Then looking into the fact that this is really going to impact future development. There are possibilities that may impact existing developments, or someone may be able to redevelop part of their site, change their parking lot when there's a lesser development or lesser requirement. But again, this is mainly forward thinking for new development and looking at current trends within the county to determine what the appropriate rates are.
No, I agree, and I'm glad you're doing it, but I just want to make sure that we have more public transportation because we suffer greatly from it in our county. Now, the other thing that you mentioned before was you want less parking space and more green space to be able to absorb the water. Yet the county, came up with a rule where if I have a house and I want to rent my basement as a separate unit, even though it's the same square footage, I haven't added anything to the house, I have to add an extra space for it to become an auxiliary dwelling. So can we look at, this is for the county person, for Mike, can we look at such insane new laws that don't make sense and change them? If I'm adding a dwelling fine. You want more space, fine. But for me, when we're not adding the dwelling, we're just converting the basement to a separate dwelling, then why do we have to have an extra parking space and take space away from our garden to put in more asphalt? Do you see the contradiction? On one hand, you want less asphalt somewhere, on another hand, you're requiring more.
I see the contradiction. Part of that conversation, I think, came out of the ZMOD process and how accessory dwelling units were being treated. It was certainly there were a lot of perspectives involved in that conversation in association with ZMOD, and that ended up being the result of those conversations is that the board approved an approach that required this additional space for ADUs.
And
There's no way you can change that. Anyone can apply for a change or an exception or anything.
well, there always is. I mean, you can reach out to your elected official in your magisterial district and voice your concerns in that way. But I would also say that when it came to that change, and I work for the ordinance administration section who changed ZMOD and worked through ZMOD, what I would say with that is that came out of community concern regarding spillover parking in certain areas. That was a result of outreach, community concern, and the whole process and the public process with ZMOD to add that section about having that parking space on site. So what I would say is that you're probably your best bet there, if it's a concern you have, is to reach out to your district supervisor and let them know your concern and have that conversation. And if it's something that they feel is an issue that they want to address, they will have further conversations regarding that.
Austin, this is
Mhm.
Leslie.
Mhm.
I could address the comment a little bit in that as part of the board's adoption. My name is Leslie Johnson. I'm the zoning administrator. As part of the adoption of the ZMOD, one of the follow-on motions was for staff to come back to the board with kind of a report on the ALUs, the accessory living units, and the home-based business provisions, to kind of give them a status of, what we've seen, issues that have come up for people that have been trying to address, to install them, and where are we? And we're going to be doing that probably, and sending something out to the board in December, and we'll post it. And it may be that as part of that, the board may want to have additional conversations about that. I don't know, to be quite honest with you, whether we've had enough review or have enough of them coming in to really understand what that parking requirement has done. So, I mean, that is something that we can monitor and look at. So, but I just wanted to let you know that we are just as we will with parking. When it goes to the board and we get to the point where we have something that we want to take to the board for public hearing, for authorization, and then there'll be public hearings and discussion. I mean, this process right now is to get your feedback so that we can make changes or identify issues that we want to bring to the board's attention. But I would imagine that they'll want to do the same thing. And, within 18 months, of adoption, that there are things that they want us to come back and look at. It's not a static document. I mean, things do change, and we're trying, to keep up with those changes. Things are changing faster than all of us can keep up with. So, we do that monitoring. So.
Thank you. I have one last question, really. So on your map, you showed areas, the orange areas and whatever, where the changes are going to happen. So if it's not marked on the map, no changes are going to happen?
If it's not on the areas shown on the map that are in colors, that was green is our revitalization area, then you had that orange-red area, which was your transit station area. Those are the tiers. So those are where a 10% reduction, 20% reduction, 30% reduction, and such would be impacted. The gray areas were your suburban centers. Areas that are not shown in a specific called out color, the rest of the county is then subject to the base parking requirements that we've been talking about. Those would would be the minimum requirements that we're currently proposing. So all areas of the county may be impacted in a way, but the areas that are shown in those colors on the map are areas that for certain reasons have been defined within the comprehensive plan as a suburban center, commercial revitalization area, transit station area, or transit-oriented development. And thus we have aligned our project with the proposals and the comprehensive plan to then address parking within those areas.
And so all of these are under the Parking Reimagined website link that you sent?
Yeah, the parking on the Parking Reimagined website, there is a link to that map that kind of shows all this, as well as a white paper that explains some of the proposals when it comes to the different areas, and also updated rates. And I would say just keep looking on that webpage as we go forward. We'll have more documents coming out in the future, kind of better explaining certain aspects of this as we work through parts of this project. Okay. I'll have a question for the county person later on, but I want to let the other people go first. Thank you. So I'm going to go to Sonia real quick in the comments. And Sonia asked the question, will you be including bike parking? So many places have none, and that's a big issue when trying to bike places. We are looking at bike parking requirements as part of this project. We're currently reviewing the possibility of including bike parking requirements in this ordinance. So I would say that yes, that's something we're looking into, and that we would like to have bike parking requirements as part of this, and we're determining how and where we can implement bike parking requirements. All right. And the next question, Little Lulu 8 asked, please speak about libraries and parks. Mike, can you address libraries and parks real quick and what we're doing there?
Sure. As part of the release that we had this past week on proposed public parking rates, that included libraries and parks. And so for libraries, the current rate, I believe, is 7 spaces per 1,000 gross square feet. We've looked at information associated with average library parking, and we found that demand is actually, the average demand is actually closer to 4 spaces per 1,000, with that kind of, when you're looking at these sort of mathematical ratios. It was actually a little bit less than 4. So we've proposed a minimum rate of 4 spaces per 1,000 for libraries going forward. For parks, we're also working with the Park Authority to get some more information from them, some more feedback from them, similar to what we're doing with schools, to see how they want to look at parking for their facilities. What we've proposed at this point is for neighborhood parks and for urban parks to have no minimum requirement. Typically, particularly for the urban parks, those are located like places like Tyson's, where you would expect that to be walked to generally. It's usually a smaller park. It has like a playground and places to sit and enjoy the area. So it's more of a walk-up park rather than a drive-up park. And the neighborhood parks are also, from the Park Authority's perspective, they consider those to be more of a walk-up park than a drive-up park. The larger parks, we're still looking at, in conjunction with the Park Authority, looking at what the appropriate amount of parking is. At this point, our recommendation is for director approval, and then director would be my director, Land Development Services. We have the administrative ability associated with Article 6 and parking to make those determinations. So that would be sort of a consultative effort at this point with Park Authority. If they have a proposal, we work with them to figure out how that parking should be sized, how many spaces provided, based on the facilities that are going to be put in place at these park areas. So that's where we are with libraries and parks.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. My name is actually Linda Byrne, and through Michael Wing and Supervisor Palchak's office, you've sent me some information, and I really appreciate you looking at those things. I'm on several friends groups that are concerned about the libraries and the parks. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Fran, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I want to go back to the question that was asked about the requiring an additional parking space. When we were doing ZMOD, one of the things that came up was that a lot of the areas where there are single-family detached houses do not have curb and gutter. So you can't legally park on the street. So if you're going to be adding another unit, which might require bring in another car, the discussion was that maybe that parking space needs to be on the property. So that's a piece of the package that gets lost in doing all of this, that a lot of places do not have curb and gutter, and that we have a lot of streets that are barely 2 lanes. So you don't have a really safe way to park on the street, nor do you have a legal way to park on the street when there's no curb and gutter. And I think that's all part of the discussion. We need to do something that makes sense for everybody. Just a
Thank you.
comment.
Yep, thank you, Fran. And in the comment box, in the chat box, Sonia asked, will Parking Reimagine get into the design of parking lots to add sidewalks to improve safety for walking through them, adding trees and better stormwater management? And that's a question, will we be adding trees and better stormwater management? Mike, would you like to address that?
Sure. Clearly, we are, as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to align the most innovative approaches to places where we're already building the infrastructure, the walkable infrastructure, and we expect to continue that. We're planning for more of that. This has been a question that has come up in a number of conversations with regard to the relationship between transportation, multimodal improvements, and that network, and that relationship to Parking Reimagined. And I will say that FCDOT, our county's Department of Transportation, has a pretty significant project that they're working on now, called, I think it's called Access Fairfax. I may be not referring that completely correctly, but their multimodal group, bicycle, pedestrian, and other alternative forms of transportation like scooters and things like that. They are working on enhancing that network. And it's a large project, a lot of community feedback expected with that project as well. And being able and planning out these types of facilities within the county. It's certainly recognized by transportation as well as us in this project, with the development community, with staff who's reviewing development, that these multimodal facilities are important, and certainly it's a priority for us when we are negotiating with applicants on development applications, even by right applications. We work to get as much infrastructure as we can get as part of those conversations and plan submittals. So it is very important, and certainly recognized to be very important to this relationship of less parking and more abilities to get around our community without needing a car. And so we're hoping to continue to build on that.
And so Mike, to add on to what Mike was saying there, you asked about adding trees and stormwater management as well. Well, one of the things we're looking at doing is having a provision in the ordinance that, let's say you have a use that has a parking rate. Let's say it's 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet. And that use is then changing. So it's a single building. It's going to have a higher parking requirement where you're going to be required to add more parking on the site to establish a use. And you have trees on the site that are, established trees, something like that. We're looking at rates, or at a provision that would be kind of a tree safe provision that would allow for an altering of a rate by administrative process based on established trees located on site, as well as if there was some sort of historic aspect to the site that we wouldn't, of course, want you to remove any of that historic aspect to meet a parking requirement. And I'd further say that we are always looking at ways to try to incentivize not only just, electric vehicle charging, bike parking, things like that, but also green space. And so when it comes to stormwater management, one of the aspects of redevelopment is that if someone does come in and redevelop part of their site, and they're redeveloping, let's just say it's a parking lot that's been there for 60 years, inherently by redeveloping that parking lot is going to be better designed now than it was 60 years ago to then address stormwater management on their site. And so by allowing certain types of development, we can actually impact that stormwater management. And as well, like I said, we absolutely are looking at ways to try to incentivize environmental stewardship through this process. All right. Next, Renee says, can this parking ordinance affect paid on-street parking rates such that money collected will be invested in alternative modes of transportation? And if not, is that ordinance up for consideration? So this is for off-street parking. This is your parking in parking lots. You're parking with on private sites. It is not related to on-street parking. I'll let Mike touch on the on-street parking efforts that FCDOT is currently looking into or has been working on.
Sure. FCDOT has been looking at establishing a on-street paid parking system in areas of Tyson's and in areas of Reston. And the county has, it seems like it should be a simple thing, but it's not. The county had to get legislation to allow legislation, if you will, to allow metered parking to be established on public streets. It would not be on private streets. And there are a number of streets in Fairfax County that are private streets. But in that process, they're looking at a way to be able to administer metered parking. The other element to that is, when you have meter violations or people that are not moving, there's there's the possibility of towing or booting, and that still would need to be worked out as well. So there are a lot of different components to administering an on-street parking program, but they are working toward that goal. I do not know what their plans are for the revenue associated with metered parking once they establish it. If you want more information about that program, you should contact the Fairfax County Department of Transportation. The contact person in that agency for this project is named Henry, Henri Stein McCartney. And she would have more details about where they are with this program and where they hope to be in the coming years.
Thanks, Mike. Jenna asked, are we looking at the impact of massive lots of heat islands? She says she believes that Annandale is the highest surface temps in all of DMV due to the poor urban planning and massive lots, and what other suburban communities are doing this as well. So to address your second part of the question, what other communities? A notable community that just recently passed a type of ordinance like this is the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, as well as Loudoun County is looking at a process very similar to this currently. We looked at neighboring jurisdictions such as Arlington, Montgomery County, Prince William County, Prince George County, and then nationally we looked at places like Somerville, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. We looked at Aspen, Colorado. We looked at where else, Mike, that I'm forgetting that we reviewed.
I think you got all of them.
We reviewed a lot of different ordinances that are kind of looking at innovation towards parking, but this is a trend that we are seeing nationally of trying to innovate parking requirements. And the question about heat island impacts. Heat island impacts are something we are very aware of. And we are currently going through a process, a separate amendment looking at parking lot landscaping. And that amendment is an amendment that we hope will be able to address some of the concerns and some of the impacts of heat island by looking at our ordinance as it relates to landscaping and screening on sites. And then Najla, you have a question, and then Renee had another question in the chat box there. So Najla, go ahead.
Right. I mean, Fran, I think you're the one who talked about the auxiliary dwelling unit. Yes, I can understand that if there is no room to park on the street, then you may require a new one. But if nothing has changed, if there is already room, if there are already storm water gutters or whatever you call them, And if there is no change in the size of the house, then why would anyone require more parking? That does not make any sense, but anyhow, I will send in my comments wherever I need to. But I do have a question regarding the McLean West Falls Church Metro. They had paid parking along the street next to it for years. And now for years, those meters are not working. The signs are still there. So we don't know whether we can park or not. No one dares park over there because they're afraid of a ticket. But yet this whole street space is wasted. Why would they keep parking meters there when they're not functioning? And why would they not change the signs and tell us exactly what's allowed and what's not allowed?
I think those meters are owned by WMATA Metro Rail. They're not county parking meters. There have been a lot of conversations about the West Falls Church Station and development opportunities out there. There's a garage, there's the parking garage for the Metro station. They're talking about perhaps revamping that in conjunction with a joint development proposal for other construction out there. So that it may be one of those transitional situations where, you know, they're not operating those meters. There's not enough, you know, because the parking garage itself doesn't get full all the time. So there might not be demand for those metered spaces. But I'm pretty sure those meters are operated by Metro. So that's something we'd have to bring up to Metro to find out more information about how they're managing that parking.
And again, that would be on-street parking in a lot of cases as well, which is addressed by Fairfax County Department of Transportation, where we're looking at off-street parking.
I know, but again, we're trying to solve parking in general, and it's a pity to waste so much parking space. And they're also adding, I don't know, 600 units to that area. It's going to be insane over there. The projects that are coming up are absolutely insane. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for your
Thank you.
comments. Renee in the chat asked, similar to the bike parking questions, will this ordinance address requirements for EV parking? We are looking at EV parking and looking at ways to incentivize EV parking on a site. And so the ways we're doing that is by allowing, and we have in our ordinance recently, within the last couple of years, approved provision that allows for EV parking to count towards a minimum parking requirement. So we're not having you add parking for EV per se. We're looking at ways to incentivize EV spaces on site and as well just to kind of incentivize EV in general. And so by that, the ways we're doing that is by allowing for EV parking. Let's say that you add in so many EV parking spaces, but it takes a spot out. You know, you add in 5 spaces or 6 spaces and it takes 2 spaces out because you have to add in some sort of infrastructure for EV. We're not going to put you in a non-conformance situation or put you in a situation where you couldn't do that because you would be no longer meeting a parking requirement per se. So if you're adding those EV spaces, there's going to be a kind of a leeway of allowing that EV without putting you into some sort of a non-conformance or non-compliance. And we're also, you know, looking at possibilities towards, you know, how and where we could require EV and if we can require EV in certain areas. So that's something that has is nationally is a really big trend we're seeing, and we are aware of it and we're looking into it. And Renee's follow-up was, what's the incentive then? The incentive is that we're looking at the possibility of reductions or further reductions or some sort of incentive that requiring EV on site along with other types of aspects could allow you to reduce parking by a certain percentage. That's something that we're still looking into. We're not 100% sure about, but again, we're trying to find ways to incentivize EV on site. And one of those ways is by not dinging you, not creating a non-conformance when people want to add EV. Okay, and then Fran had their question up, and then Jenna after Fran.
Well, 2 things if you could talk about briefly, and that is loading spaces and how that figures into the calculations here, and also waivers. What is subject to waivers and how will that be worked out?
Okay. Mike, do you want to address the waivers question? I can address the loading question.
Sure. And just to clarify, when you're asking about waivers, are you asking about parking reduction opportunities, or are you asking about other types of waivers? I'm not sure.
Specifically parking.
Well, there's, I guess, the ordinance is not, I mean, there are a lot of times where, the board will take an action as part of a zoning case and they'll waive certain requirements. And it typically doesn't happen with parking. There are opportunities with parking to get parking reductions. And there's a whole section of our ordinance that outlines these options for parking reductions. It's something that is evaluated by staff on a case-by-case basis. And then a recommendation is made to the board. There are some parking reductions that can be done administratively by the director of my agency. But in each one of those cases, it's something that's evaluated by staff first before a recommendation is made and action taken.
So this would include like shared parking arrangements?
Correct.
Okay.
Those types of requests would come under that umbrella.
Thank you.
And to loading, yeah, we are currently looking at our loading requirements, and we'll be releasing those proposed loading requirements here shortly. But yes, that is part of this. And we were looking at, again, right sizing and in some places lowering loading requirements based on data that we have and trends that we've noticed. That's something that our consultant, Nelson Nygaard and Clarion Associates, helped us on. They've actually helped us throughout this entire process. And I would say in the next coming weeks to be watching our webpage, we should be adding the loading requirements up there.
And that can be waived also?
Loading is, yeah, so through an entitlement process, if there's like a rezoning or a special exception, a developer may request a waiver of those, and it's something that the board would then look at to determine if they would want to grant a waiver of those regulations.
Okay, thank you.
Jenna.
Thank you. I guess this is more of a comment than a question about a very specific situation at Justice High School. And I'm not sure if that's something you guys have been involved with or aware of. It's just a very difficult situation because we have the smallest footprint of any school in the county. We're right up against Arlington County, so our boundaries, can't be a circumference around the school. There's a park across the street that was proposed to have some parking added that can be used by the school and the park, and the homeowners around the park fought back against that. And it just turned into a really difficult situation, pitting staff and students and families versus homeowners and other families. They ended up rezoning to have a smaller amount of parking spaces required at the school. So I know this is fairly unique because of our small footprint, and we're very, very densely populated with a lot of our housing being very overpopulated due to our demographics. So like I said, it's really more of a comment, but it's really, really been a very difficult issue in our community. It's been very, very divisive. And it's really unfortunate. We've lost some teachers due to this because they can easily go to a different school where they can park, and they're not told, we'll take a bus to get to your job or take a bike to get to work, which is, can be quite condescending, not knowing people's situations. So yeah, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to attend today, because we've put in a tremendous amount of time on it from the PTA standpoint. And there's really no good resolution in sight. It's very unfortunate. It's very difficult.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you for your comments. Does anybody else have any questions or comments regarding today's discussion? Any further insights on parking that you might have? Well, I just want to say I appreciate everyone's participation today. I wasn't sure what to expect. This is the first time we've done a Saturday open house. So I wasn't sure what to expect, people's schedules and activities on the weekends, but we've had a good turnout for this conversation and lots of good questions and comments. So I'm very thankful that everyone who participated today had some feedback and hopefully had some good thoughts about what we're doing with this project. So I just want to say thanks once again to the participants as well as staff for setting this up.
Thank you for giving up your weekend.
Yeah, no problem. We're trying as much as we can through this process to give diverse public opportunities for the public to engage, so that it be evenings, daytime during the week, or weekend opportunities to try to hear everyone's voice as it pertains to this project. I'd also like to say that, as mentioned previously, if you're interested in this project, I highly recommend following the Parking Reimagine webpage and looking for up-to-date type documents that come out. Again, we have majority of our rates currently out there and proposed documents with a website or an email address where you can provide comments. And then in the coming months, you would be able to see actually kind of a more full proposal, including the administrative sections of our ordinance, the reduction sections of our ordinance, and kind of a whole package that we're proposing. So I highly recommend looking, keeping that webpage favorited, going to the webpage periodically and checking that, and also looking for future opportunities. We're going to be having 2 more open houses, one in September and one in October, to kind of talk about some other rates and possibly some of the entirety of the package when it comes to administrative provisions and reductions. But I'll echo what Mike said, and thank you so much for giving us your time on a Saturday morning to opine on the Parking Reimagine project. If there's no other questions or comments, I'll close the meeting and like I say again, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Austin. Thank you, Michael.
Bye now.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
All right.